This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming platform built by and for creators, when you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below. The United States is the richest nation in the world by far. It would stand to reason that the population of the US is also the best compensated for their labor, both in terms of salary or hourly wage and benefits like vacation time and parental leave. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you won't be surprised to learn that's not actually the case. In fact, US workers are some of the worst compensated among wealthy nations, and that's just for those who are lucky enough to find stable work. In this episode, we're going to discuss another problem, the constant unemployment crisis, and why American unemployment numbers are far worse than they're reported to be. Let's go back to the late 1800s, when a statistician named Carroll Wright came up with a definition for unemployment, a state of being he referred to as industrial hypochondria. For some historical background, Wright was the head of the Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics, and in 1878, he commissioned one of the very first US unemployment surveys. This wasn't simply out of curiosity. The country had suffered a financial panic in 1873, and 5 years later, the nation was still very much in a depression. The press had been reporting some very concerning unemployment numbers, and Wright needed to come up with a way to tamp down potential political unrest. His solution was to redefine unemployment. He tasked the town assessors and local police with counting out-of-work citizens, but not all of them. In order to suppress the alarmingly high unemployment figures, Wright was concerned only with able-bodied men over the age of 16 and only those who, quote, really wanted to work. This, of course, excluded the many women and young men who would normally be working but had since become unemployed. Wright's restrictions and his intentionally vague men who really wanted to work yielded the desired result. By carving out a large portion of the working population, the report showed considerably lower unemployment. Wright would go on to become the first head of the National Bureau of Labor Statistics, and he took his deceptive definition of unemployment with him. Ever since the 1870s, this insufficient definition has been used to artificially suppress real unemployment figures. And every time a crisis comes along, elected officials can point to the overly optimistic numbers and say, see, everything is fine. If you watch the news these days, you'll often hear unemployment figures used as a political weapon. New reports are released pretty frequently, and it's a common tactic for politicians of both parties to skew and spin those numbers to fit their narrative. With the presidential election just around the corner and the country still reeling from the pandemic, expect unemployment to remain a major talking point. One side will say unemployment is at unprecedented levels, while still not acknowledging the true scale of the problem, and the other will say it would be much worse under opposition leadership. Regardless of partisan posturing, neither party is willing to admit that the US unemployment situation is far worse than it seems, and it's only been getting worse over the years. Let's take another look at the definition of unemployment. To be considered unemployed in the United States, you need to be making $0 from work and actively be seeking employment. That is, constantly applying for jobs. This definition is overly restrictive. It excludes people who earn only a small amount of money per week, like many gig economy workers. It excludes those who have stopped looking for work due to the state of the economy and the lack of jobs, and those who would like to work but can't because they have to take care of children. A better definition of unemployment would be any person who is looking for a full-time job that pays a living wage but cannot find one. That living wage part is the most critical piece to understand. The US is notorious for predatory employment practices, including paying workers far less than what would be considered a living wage in the rest of the developed world. For example, there is not a single county in the US, not one, where a full-time minimum wage job would cover the expense of renting a 2-bedroom apartment. And in over 95% of those counties, a minimum wage earner couldn't afford a 1-bedroom. And that's not even counting other necessities like food and utilities. This is because the federal minimum wage hasn't been adjusted to match inflation or productivity gains in over a decade. The cost of living has gone up, productivity has gone up, but the minimum wage has remained the same. If the minimum wage had simply kept up with the rate of productivity, it would be over $22 per hour today. Instead, it's $7.25. This is only one example of the horrific state of labor in the US, but it should show you that things are not as rosy as they're made out to be. Let's apply our new definition of unemployment to the US. In January of 2020, the official unemployment rate was 3.6%. That doesn't sound so bad. According to a recent study by the Ludwig Institute for Shared Economic Prosperity, the true rate of unemployment was 7 times that number, a shocking 23.4%. Nearly a quarter of all Americans who want to work can't find a job that pays a living wage. But wait, that was back in January. A few months later, after we completely botched the coronavirus response and destroyed the lives of millions of hardworking Americans, the numbers got even worse. The latest numbers indicate that if we count everybody over the age of 16 who is actively seeking a living wage, 54.6% of Americans are unemployed. Over half of the entire working population cannot find a job that will support them enough to pay the bills, let alone to save for retirement, to start a family, or for medical expenses. This is more than just an economic crisis, this is a moral outrage. The fact that over half the population isn't paid a living wage in the richest country on earth is a damning indictment of a predatory system that is growing worse by the year, treating its own citizens like raw materials to be consumed by the machine. This isn't a new problem. It's been a slow-burning crisis since the 1980s, when worker bargaining power was gutted and supreme control handed over to massive corporations. But look, those in power say, the unemployment rate is only 8.4%. Sure, that's a little high, but it's just because of the pandemic. Of course, they know perfectly well that the true unemployment rate is many times higher, and the only thing standing between massive unrest and maintaining the status quo from which they benefit is spinning the numbers and lying about the real depth of the problem. Let's take an historical example. Back in 2008, in the aftermath of the housing crash, no one wanted to admit how bad things had gotten. 7 million Americans lost their homes in what would become known as the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. In March of 2008, a jobs report came out which stated, despite the economy shedding 63,000 jobs, unemployment was down, from 4.9% to 4.8%. How could this be accurate? As we saw earlier, the official definition of unemployment doesn't count those who have simply given up. And in 2008, there were a lot of despondent, hopeless people. Since those people were not actively applying for jobs, since there were no jobs to be found, they weren't considered unemployed. When the future for millions of Americans was at its most bleak, the official jobs report looked great. This is all part of propagandizing the population to believe everything is okay, that our country is thriving, and that anyone who wants to work can find a job to support themselves and their family. This is simply not true. To continue our 2008 example, many politicians claimed that unemployment was below the average of the last 30 years. If it's lower than in the past, how could it be bad? This may seem like a convincing argument on the surface, but it's deeply misleading. Consider this. In the decades leading up to the crash of 2008, millions more people had begun falling into the categories not counted by the official definition of unemployment. As one 2008 article pointed out, the average unemployment rate in this decade, just above 5%, has been lower than in any decade since the 1960s. Yet the percentage of prime-age men, those 25 to 54 years old, who are not working has been higher than in any decade since World War II. In January, almost 13% of prime-age men did not hold a job, up from 11% in 1998, 11% in 1988, 9% in 1978, and just 6% in 1968. Even prime-age women who flooded into the workforce in the 1970s and 1980s aren't working at quite the same rate they were when this decade began. About 27% of them don't hold a job today, up from 25% in early 2000. So, the number of unemployed people was increasing, but the unemployment rate was going down. How was this possible? In short, people were being left behind by the economy. Many jobs were being shipped overseas, others were becoming automated, and workers without the bargaining power their grandparents had suddenly found themselves only receiving offers of half what they had earned before. This growing group, those seeking work but unable to find a reasonable wage, has only continued to grow since 2008. Massive corporations and the very wealthy rebounded from the crash just fine. Banks were bailed out, executives faced no consequences, politicians spun the recession as a fluke. All those homes that were foreclosed upon, they were snatched up at bargain prices by real estate companies and the wealthy. And to this day, they're held hostage on the rental market. What we're left with today is a dystopian labor landscape. You have to work to survive, but even that is no longer a guarantee. As new, quote, innovative industries pop up, workers are finding fewer and fewer jobs that will even classify them as employees. If you're a gig economy worker, an Uber driver for example, you're racking up miles on your own car, driving absurd hours to make pennies, and the company does not provide you with any benefits because you're not an employee. Then when your car breaks down and you have to spend all the money you've made to get it fixed, where does that leave you? Uber certainly won't help. You're just a cog in their machine. It's the perfect scam, and other parasites who fancy themselves savvy business people are eager to get in on the action. The gig economy is just the most recent example of how the labor market has destroyed the earning potential of American workers. Traditional jobs won't pay you a living wage, but you need to pay the bills, so you think maybe if you just work long enough hours driving for Lyft, you can get ahead. Then you find yourself trapped in the gig economy, still making less than a living wage, with no healthcare, no benefits, no vacation, and no way to save for the future. All the while, politicians will tell you that the unemployment rate is only 8.4%, so it must be your own fault for not finding suitable work. Don't fall for it. The true unemployment rate is almost 30%, or over 50% if you include younger workers. The economy doesn't work for workers, and we need to be aware of just how bad the situation actually is. If you've watched my last few videos, you'll have noticed that YouTube has been demonetizing a lot of them. That's why some of my creator friends and I teamed up to build Nebula, a streaming platform built by and for YouTubers like me, so we don't have to worry about demonetization. Since Nebula is all about creating thoughtful content, we've partnered with CuriosityStream, an established streaming platform with a solid track record of caring about great educational content and the financial security of those who produce it. CuriosityStream is an online streaming service with thousands of nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. You can find tons of great episodes like The Future of Work, which offers a fascinating look at what work could be like in the decades to come. As educational creators ourselves, we love CuriosityStream. So, we've worked out a deal, where if you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below, you'll also get access to Nebula, 100% free. For a limited time, CuriosityStream is offering 26% off their annual plan. That's less than $15 a year for both CuriosityStream and Nebula, which, in my humble opinion, is a pretty great deal. Since we're all stuck inside anyway, why not spend some time learning about fascinating topics on CuriosityStream, or check out Nebula's exclusive content, including my upcoming series on the resurgence of fascism. You can also watch all my videos as they were intended, ad-free. There really is something for everyone, and by signing up at the link below, you're helping us produce more content without the fear of demonetization. Give CuriosityStream a shot, and get free access to Nebula when you sign up using the link below. It really does help support my channel and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like it, consider subscribing to stay up to date with my latest episodes. If you hated it, go ahead and drop a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.